Now, this year's annual Nelson Mandela Lecture will be delivered by the United Nations chief on July the 18th. The Nelson Mandela Foundation announced that the theme of the lecture this year is tackling the Inequality Pandemic, a new social contract for a new era. The lecture by the 9th Secretary-General Antonio Guterres comes at a time of great global unease amidst an international public health emergency due to the coronavirus and, of course, other global fragilities, including racism, protracted conflicts and climate change as well. For more on this now, we're joined by SABC News Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York. Great to chat to you as always, Sherwin. First things first, how will this lecture be happening given the border, the travel restrictions that are still likely to be in place come the middle of July?
Well, unfortunately, South Africans won't be able to welcome Secretary-General Antonio Guterres to South Africa because of COVID-19 border restrictions and generally public health concerns. The Secretary-General will not be traveling to South Africa, so this event will be a virtual event between the UN headquarters here in New York. He will speak from the UN headquarters in New York, but there will also be an element coming out of the Nelson Mandela Foundation in Houghton, Johannesburg. So it will be a dual broadcast virtually on various online platforms, on television networks, including the SABC, and on radio. So you'll be covered in terms of being able to hear what the SG has to say. We will be engaging with him on his remark to that lecture, but he won't be there in person.
So he is one of the most prominent authorities in the world. Many will likely argue that given the times we find ourselves in, it's fitting for the Secretary-General of the United Nations to be delivering this lecture.
And following in a very healthy legacy, if you will, between the Nelson Mandela Foundation and the United Nations. This will not be the first senior UN who delivered in 2007, the likes of Mary Robinson, the former Irish president and the former High Commissioner for Human Rights. Chilean President Michelle is the current High Commissioner for Human Rights. She's spoken there before. Amina Mohammed delivered the lecture, the Deputy Secretary-General, whom you also saw in that clip, delivered it in 2017. So there is a long history of a close relationship with senior UN officials that the Nelson Mandela Foundation has sought to maintain much man for this moment, Francis, given the public health emergency and the centrality of the multilateral system that the UN provides to the world. You know, when we talk about COVID-19 or the coronavirus pandemic, we often hear the DG of the World Health Organization talk about the importance of a collective response, a collaborative response. And I think you're going to hear a lot of that in Antonio Guterres' lecture. You know, he released a statement after the announcement from the Nelson Mandela Foundation earlier today, and he talks about how Madiba was a moral giant of the 20th century, but that his timeless legacy continues to be a guide in the 21st century. For me, he says, he was also a profound inspiration for justice, dignity, and equality. This year's lecture takes place at a time when the world faces an unprecedented test as the COVID-19 pandemic threatens everyone, everywhere. So the centrality here of the United Nations very, very key in terms of how you deal and arrest this COVID-19 pandemic, but also with an eye to the future. This will not just be an articulation of the problems facing the world, Francis, but how, as we work together through a multilateral fora, we are able to solve those problems.
Yeah. Sherwin, the link is not great, but let's just see if we can talk about the topic a little bit more. The Foundation says the lecture will focus on the current inequalities that have come under sharp relief during the pandemic, and we'll look ahead to what we must do to address the world's fragilities and build a fair globalization. So that solidarity you're talking about, just tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the problems, you know, we've been discussing the global issue and scourge of racism. We're discussing the global scourge, and in the South African context in particular, of gender-based violence. You look at the climate change emergency that is beckoning. You look at a number of ills, protracted conflicts, the problems that climate change in the future will present, and what the United Nations has been saying for decades now.